Here we go. Welcome everybody to our weekly seminar series at the Department of Marine Geosciences. And today we have Dr. Naomi Lavin from University of Michigan in the United States, who woke up very early to be with us. So thank you very much. Naomi received her bachelor and BS and BA degrees in geology and anthropology from Stanford University in 2000. She completed her MS at University of Arizona in 2002, her PhD at the University of Utah in 2008, and postdoctoral work at Caltech in 2009. Naomi was an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins from 2009 to 2016, and she has been a professor at the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences in 2016. She uses a combination of field geology and isotope geochemistry to understand how landscapes and organisms respond to past climate change. Many of her efforts have focused on developing new ways to track the water balance in ancient terrestrial systems, and she has worked extensively in Eastern Africa, reconstructing the environmental context of human evolution. Wow, really interests me personally. So with these words, we welcome you virtually this time, and I hope very much that we will host you personally in the future. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for having me. Um, so I'm just gonna give you a slice and look at how we can use triple oxygen isotopes, so this 17O, to think about the paleoclimate toolkit um, and you'll understand this rare and overlooked in a second, but I hope that you take from this talk that it's powerful and that we can sort of there's a rationale for continuing to develop it. Okay, so a lot of my career has been focused on thinking about how we can do more with oxygen isotope records from terrestrial archives. Now, I realize that not everybody here is focusing on paleoclimate, but the oxygen isotopes have been used extensively in paleoclimate and in all sorts of ways, actually, to study the Earth system, since oxygen is such an abundant element, and we take advantage of this rare this heavy isotope, this rare isotope 18O, in its relationship to 16O. And so the sort of the premise of this talk and a lot of my career over the past, I don't know, decade and a half has been really thinking about what additional stories could we tell about climate, hydrology, ecology, tectonics, with if we could constrain how delta 18O varies in the geologic record better. So this is going to be an example that I'm just going to give you of actually a subject area that we'll talk about later in the talk today. But this is a record from Lake Hunin. So the red line here is a lake record, and going back from the present and from lake record carbonate delta 18O. So this, for those of you not familiar, this is this ratio of 18 to 16O isotopes, and going back to almost the last glacial maximum, not quite. And this is sort of what's typical. This is from a lake in the central Andes of Peru, and this is insolation. So low insolation is here, high insolation is here. And the question is, how do you interpret this? You might think about, okay, well, higher delta 18O values up here might mean that the lake was more evaporated in the past. Lower values, you might say, oh, it's greater monsoon strength, more rainfall, maybe a different moisture source. And with only delta 18O, you have all of these variables that you can't really constrain very well. This study, as you can see from this legend, actually this is a combination of this is a combines other studies. So Huascarón is an ice core record from delta 18O. This yellow is Huagapo. This is a speleothem record. And this darker blue is Pumacocha, which is another lake right up here, a smaller lake system next to Lake Hunin. So this was actually a compilation of data. This Lake Hunin red record was originally published in the 1990s. And they contextualized this delta 18O record on the red by comparing it to local complementary records and saying, okay, regional records have decreased over this time period, indicating probably this higher insolation, higher monsoon coming down this way. And this difference, so how this difference is sort of decreasing between this Lake Hunin record, which is a shallow lake system, and these other records is because there's more evaporation around the start of the Holocene, and this the separation between these records is decreasing. So less evaporation, which also makes sense. So the monsoon strength is changing, it's intensifying, and that's also causing lower delta H&O values of the whole entire system, and less evaporation of this lake, the shallow Lake Hunin. Okay. However, these complementary records, delta H&O records, are not always available, especially as you go back in time. So we're really stuck with interpreting a lot of the delta H&O records of carbonates. And I'll mention that this, or any systems, and I'll mention that this applies to many other kinds of systems on lots of different time scales. I'm just giving you an example from the Holocene. Okay, okay, so delta H&O and carbonates, and I'll just focus on carbonates here, and I'll use lake temperatures in my very sort of rudimentary graphic here, is sensitive to a lot of different factors. So in purple, this delta H&O of carbonate is going to be a function of the oxygen isotopic composition of the lake itself, and then the temperature at which it forms. So this is assuming, let's say, equilibrium processes. This carbonate is going to be a reflection of temperature and oxygen isotopic composition of the lake. The oxygen isotopic composition of the lake itself is then a function of basically a lot of the mass balance of what's coming in and out of the lake, and the oxygen isotopic composition of precipitation. And oxygen isotopic composition of precipitation is a function of monsoon strength or amount effect, or sometimes in deeper time elevation or moisture sources. So this term in itself, the delta H&O of precipitation, has a lot of different controls. So when we're measuring this oxygen isotopic composition of carbonate, there's so many different things that can go into it. So temperature, evaporative water loss, the oxygen isotopic composition of these different water inputs, let's say runoff or groundwater flow, and then also this oxygen isotopic composition of precipitation, which has a lot of different variables to it. Okay, so we've got recent advances. That's another isotopic tool, which is basically the clumping of isotopes that 13 Cs and 18 Os like to clump in the same molecule at sort of end up in the same, preferentially clump in the same molecule at colder temperatures. So this is a technique that I'll sort of mention some data for, but won't go into. So we can constrain this value, but even if we can constrain temperature and reconstruct the oxygen isotopic composition of the lake, we're still stuck with not knowing whether evaporation or the oxygen isotopic composition of precipitation is affecting our reconstructed lake values. So we're kind of in a bind, especially in systems where we think evaporation is a really big effect on our systems. Okay, so what I want to do today is give you an overview of the basics of triple oxygen isotope distributions in the hydrosphere, and introduce an example of this in modern lakes and in Holocene applications. So we're actually going to go back to that example that I just talked to you about. I had this in the talk originally, and I'm sort of keeping it as a hedger, but I just want to say that I don't think we'll have enough time, but we could, I also could sort of explain to you and give a preview of 17O in soil carbonates in teeth. So we're also developing similar modern studies and applications in those systems. But another objective is, I want you to consider the potential to use this 17O, or what we call CAP 17O. This is this capital delta 17O, to tackle paleoclimate problems. And I hope convince you why I think this is an exciting new avenue of research. Okay, this work is being done. This is a very long-term, decades-long effort by many people. And so I'm going to give you a summary of work. Some of these people's work I'll cite, and some of them I will they sort of contribute to the body of it. But this has been a huge effort. A lot of this work is done with my colleague, Ben Passy, who also co-directs this lab that we run at the University of Michigan. But this work started also while we were at Johns Hopkins. And a lot of our work is focusing on water, so modern systems to really understand how the systems work today. Then soil carbonates, which is something I've worked on before I started getting into 17O, and teeth, speleothems, and then method development is a big part of this, and applications. So I'll just give you a little bit of a sliver of this taste. Okay, so we've talked about this already, but why bother studying triple oxygen isotope variation? We need to better constrain delta 18O-based paleoclimate archives. They often have too many degrees of freedom, especially in terrestrial records. Like, this evaporation piece is really big and it's hard to constrain. We've, in the past, I'll say within the past 2 decades now, have had high precision measurements of 17O in water. And it means that we can use small variations in triple oxygen isotope distributions, and I'll explain what they mean. We can measure them. We can actually now measure these measurements, these differences precisely. And we also know that the 17O is varying in the hydrosphere. So it's varying today in the hydrosphere. And so it's something that we can translate back to the past. And then lastly, we can now make these measurements, these high precision measurements in geologic material. And so we can then think about them for paleoclimate. Okay, so let's move on. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to talk about triple oxygen isotope basics. I'll talk about a modern lake systems, and then a Holocene application. And I doubt that there's going to be time, but I have this in here just because these are my passions and I would love to talk about these two if anybody's interested in them, but just so you know, they're there. Okay, 17O basics and distribution. The 17O, this is an even more rare isotope of oxygen. So these are looking at, so 17O to 16O on the y-axis, and this is 18O to 16O ratios on the x-axis. 17O has been known about for quite some time, and it's really been a focus on thinking about other processes not involving the hydrosphere. So these are called these mass-independent fractionations, and we've got this terrestrial fractionation line with a slope of around 0.5. So most 17O just varies in lockstep with 18O, and it's just like a half amount. So if you've got something that's in 18O 100 per mil, then the 17O is usually just 50 per mil. So in Earth processes, it doesn't actually really give you that much information. It's mostly, you would think, it's called mass dependent. So and everything follows this TFL, this terrestrial fractionation line with a slope of around 0.5. You have these mass independent species. So for anybody who's familiar with atmospheric chemistry, there's a lot of different processes that do not actually depend on the mass of the isotope, but other processes that will sort of kick you off this terrestrial fractionation line. And so these processes have been known for quite some time, and it's also been studied extensively in terms of looking at meteorites. However, and so this has all been known for a while, and nobody thought that there would actually be much information in the hydrosphere and within Earth, because everything just fell on this terrestrial fractionation line and in this ellipse. So in this big question, and this is what we're going to talk about today, is that, and this was why this research is relatively new and exciting, is that we're basically going to all be looking at this variation within this ellipse, and we're now discovering that the variation within this ellipse is actually really powerful. But you can see that it's a lot smaller than the variation than this triple oxygen isotopes had been studied before. Okay, so what are we talking about, and what's the notation here? There's a bunch of stuff here, but I just want to, if you've never seen isotopes before, then you can just sort of zoom out a little bit and not focus on the details. If you do study isotopes, then let me show you what we're sort of looking at. We can look at this delta 18O versus delta 17O. So these are these ratios of the heavy to the light isotopes. We see that we've got a linear relationship between this 17O on the y-axis and this 18O on the x-axis, and it's related by the slope of lambda. We see this delta prime notation. This is just a log transformation of the regular delta notation. And the reason why this is sort of done is that really the alphas, and this is here for the isotope geochemists, the isotope fractionation, these alphactors between 17O and 18O are related by a power loss or by an exponent. But the thing that I really want you to focus on is that we're really talking about this, what I call this capital 17O, or I'll say cap 17O, which refers to this relationship between delta 18O and delta 17O, and a deviation from some sort of expected relationship. So if our expected relationship is, let's say, 0.5, that terrestrial fractionation line, we would see this cap 17O is how much your sample sort of deviates from this expected relationship. So if it's an equilibrium process and it's more steep, let's say, and you fall on right above this arrow, then your cap 17O value would be 0 because you have no deviation from your expected line. If you're below the line, your cap 17O value would be negative because you deviate in a negative way. Or if you're above the line, your cap 17O value would be more positive. Okay, and so we refer to these as cap 17O values or 17O excess values, you'll also see. The deviations around this line are extremely small. So we think of them in terms of this unit per meg, which you'll see, which is 1,000th of a per mil. So these are really, really small deviations. Okay, now that you're a little bit more oriented, if anybody's familiar with the hydrology and isotope hydrology and using deuterium, this sort of system is the same, works in a similar sort of way. And you're familiar with the d-axis, it's a similar thing. You have some sort of deviation from an expected reference line. And then just the big difference is that when we're looking at the hydrogen isotopes, deuterium versus 18O, where these deviations are in per mil versus these deviations in the triple oxygen isotope system are in per meg. And so this is one reason why it took so long to sort of go after this, is that these deviations that we're looking at, like within that gray ellipse, are really small, okay? But in both cases, when you have deviations from this expected reference line, it can be due to kinetic effects. And one big kinetic effect in the hydrosphere is evaporation. And that is true for both of these systems. Okay, one more sort of nomenclature thing and to get you oriented to what you're going to see. Because these differences are so small, if we actually plotted them to scale, we actually would not, this red line and this blue line would just plot on top of each other. Our eye can't see them. So what we end up doing is we end up sort of rotating this plot, and we actually plot the CAP 17O value. So we plot the deviation. So if you have something that's plotting along an equilibrium line, along your reference line, it will just look like a horizontal line here. So CAP 17O would just be 0 and not changing, and delta 18O would be, increasing. And then the kinetic fractionation, so something becoming more and more evaporated, would be following this slope here and just rotated. And it's the same thing that for those of you who don't understand the D-axis system, the same system would be working. For our reference line, we actually use a reference line of 0.528 instead of that general 0.5. So most waters actually, the actual equilibrium value is 0.529, but most waters, it's sort of just been accepted to plot them along this low slope of 0.528. The reference, for those of you who know the hydrological system for 18O versus delta D or deuterium or 2H would be this reference slope would be 8. So this would be sort of equivalent, although things are rarely plotted in this way for DXS. Okay, so here we are. Anything that's sort of flat and along this line here would be likely an equilibrium process, so a horizontal line between CAP 17O and delta 18O, and things that are sort of falling off the line at a slope would be a kinetic process in this system, in a simple way. Okay, so I'm telling you that this is responding to evaporation and does this work. This has taken a long time. Actually, many of the first measurements were done at Hebrew University in Israel, but we built on this when I started at Hopkins, and then Phoebe Aaron, a postdoc, a graduate student, a postdoc at the University of Michigan, built on this and started to put together a compilation of different data points. And so she was actually compiling data points from other studies, and then the yellow dots were hers, and really comparing this D-axis versus the 17O. And sure enough, so D-axis, these are actually plant waters. So those of you who are biologists, these are really evaporated leaf waters. So the stem waters would be up here, but really evaporated leaf waters would be here. So remember these negative numbers in D-axis and 17O, and we can look right here. Are these falling off the line? And I realize I should probably speed up here. So they both respond to evaporation. And so this question is, can we sort of use this relationship if 17O is actually corresponding to D-axis, where we actually, in some records where we don't have hydrogen preserved, but we have oxygen preserved, can we use these records to track evaporation? And so if we can measure these carbonates, these geologic materials precisely, then perhaps we can track evaporation in the past. And this has applications for many, many different kinds of materials, and then also different kinds of questions. So aridity, basin hydrology, and monsoon dynamics. So when you're developing this, and what have we had to do? We've had to develop 17O to really address questions about paleoclimate. We needed to be able to measure 17O in materials that are preserved in the geologic record, and then really figure out the modern work of how the 17O in these materials record climate and environment today, and then start to apply them. So I'm just quickly showing this to give you a sense for people who have been working on carbonates and silicates and oxides and bioapatite and gypsum and cellulose. Many different people are working on this. I'm actually just listing examples. This is an outdated kind of list here. But this is a big part of this work. Is actually, it has not been insignificant to actually make this measurement. So a big hurdle is to actually be able to measure precisely enough to get these small per meg variations, this variation in rock earth materials. I'll also mention, for those of you who are interested in more high temperature processes, there are interesting questions that you can actually look at also at higher temperature systems as well. So anything that people measure 18O to 16O ratios today, there may be questions that could be refined. Not all questions can be refined with 17O, but it's been applied to many different kinds of systems. Okay, so this question of ours and the whole lab group has been using, can we use 17O in carbonates to track aridity? This has been a big question, and to sort of really, can we capture this variation in many different kinds of materials? So what I just want to focus on and give you sort of a flavor is to look at modern lakes and lakes in this lake application. Okay, so let's dig in here. So this here is this sort of exact question. So can we, should, 17O should track this proportion of evaporative water loss from lakes, and does it? And then also, does 17O in carbonate from lakes actually record it too? So let me sort of go in for you. So this idea is that we can use this in complement with the CAP 47 values to get at temperature. And then we can use it then, the CAP 17O, to get at evaporative water loss, right? And then once we do these two things, then we can actually look at the oxygen isotopic variation of the system, stripping off the effects of evaporation. And so this can be really powerful, and we can better reconstruct the oxygen isotopic composition of precipitation. Okay, Ben Passy and Hao Wanji first tackled this with just a handful of samples in the Western US, where there's lots of lake basins where that were really are dominated by evaporation today. And so this was just a quick look at these things. And this is what you're looking at, the same sort of delta 18O versus cap 17O. So if there was no evaporation, we would actually expect horizontal lines here. They measured, and this was just a first pass study, the inflowing water of delta 18O of inflowing water of streams, rivers into these lakes. So these are these green diamonds. And then they measured the lake water. So you can see the lake water is evaporated. And then they measured the carbonate parent water, and they reconstructed what the water value was of the carbonates that formed. And in most cases, like this pyramid lake, the carbonates actually are tracking exactly what the lake water is looking like, and they're both evaporated. In some cases, it seems like the carbonates in the lake water might be decoupled slightly, so maybe they're recording a slightly older or different system. And in some cases, so you'll see this decoupled in a variety of ways. But what they use this is like, okay, this works in a very rudimentary, basic way, and they applied a modeling technique to understand these systems. A student of mine, Sarah Katz, sort of continued this work and wanted to understand if this applied to this South America Central Andes example. And so here's this delta 18O deuterium relationship that we've seen before. This is these blue dots are where the study focuses, and you can actually see that precipitation is following on a steeper slope, and then surface waters are following on a more shallow slope. And then she did this whole thing also for 17O, and let me just sort of explain this as a more regional plot. So here again, we can see this accentuation of surface waters are following off that slope in 18O to delta D space. And then we measure cap 17O, we can see that the rainfall, right, is following more of a horizontal relationship here, where more equilibrium processes are dominating. And then this is actually compiling data from all over the place, all over the Andes, in terms of also looking at evaporative enrichment. So we can see that some waters are really following off this slope. And we know that D-excess really tracks evaporation, and 17O tracks evaporation too. And we can see this really nice linear example. Okay, so we see that this cap 17O and D-excess values of surface waters plot off these local meteoric water lines off of this sort of equilibrium relationship, and they reflect evaporation. So now this is really expanding on a much bigger way. So Sarah wanted to test here's this Lake Cunene example again, and to actually see, does cap 17O work in this system? So we're comparing Lake Cunene, which is this relatively quite large, but relatively shallow lake system, only I think 6 meters deep, 10 meters deep in some places, to smaller lakes just outside the catchment. These are just in these small glacial basins. So Pumacocha, which is represented up here, and Maycocha here. Today, Cunene is a closed lake-based basin, and Pumacocha and Maycocha are open lake basins. So she wanted to sample authigenic carbonates from these systems and also waters associated with the modern lake systems, and then also measure temperatures to see if both the 17O and this CAP 47 measurements from the carbonates reflect modern conditions. So like do what Passy and G did, but in a much more controlled way, and in direct application to a place where she wanted to study paleoclimate. So she measured these systems. So on the x-axis is the measured lake waters. So here, and then the y-axis is the measured lake waters, and the x-axis is what she reconstructed after having measured the carbonate, reconstructed waters after having measured carbonate delta 18O, carbonate 47, and carbonate 17O. So there's for these small watersheds, these are the Pumacocha and Maycocha, and then the large watersheds. This is the Hunin system. There's a one-to-one line, or very close to a one-to-one line. This is what, for isotope geochemists, this is pretty good looking in terms of this relationship. And then also for CAP 17O, she sees that there's the large watersheds, the measured lake water and the reconstructed lake water are quite close. There's a slight offset, and we think that that might be a function of some fractionation factors that we're using. But you can see that there's a general agreement also in the CAP 17O. She also then sort of considered, and this is, don't have time to go into this, but I just want to let you all know that there's, you can also sort of think about these isotopic values that we're getting in terms of doing an isotopic mass balance of these systems. So you can, this is a Monte Carlo simulation of if you start with precipitation or input water here, what are all the different possible scenarios given all the different fractionation factors and humidities and conditions of what waters you could sort of create. So these blues are the Hunin area steady waters that Sarah worked on, and these purples are the Western US waters that Passy and G worked on. And we can see here that these waters they're less, it's from a less humid kind of system. So this is a less evaporated system. But the values basically do make sense also in a lake water balance model. And Sarah has taken this extensively. So you can really think of this in a quantitative way in terms of making these interpretations. So what Sarah had is that, you know, we should see the CAP 17O does track a proportion of evaporative loss from lakes. You can actually look at differences, right, between these Western US lakes and you can and these the Central Andes lakes. You can also, within these Central Andes lakes, you can see differences in evaporative fluxes. This is Lake Junin, and these are these smaller lake systems. We also see that not only does it work in waters, but it works in carbonates as well. So this sort of gave us license to continue to use CAP 17O and carbonate to track hydrologic fluxes in past lake systems. Okay, so I want to just go back to that Holocene application that I started with. This is a second paper of Sarah's looking at Holocene temperatures and water stress, looking at clumped and triple oxygen isotopes. And I'll just highlight the key points from this, and then I'll actually talk to you about the results. But she basically shows that the CAP 17O and 47 values constrain lake temperature and water balance histories in a way that we can't do with just Delta 18O records alone. That carbonate 17O records from 3 different Andean lakes record lake hydrology and regional water balance that track insulation changes across the Holocene. And then finally, that we have intervals of low CAP 17O values that show really greater evaporation during a weakened summer monsoon during the early and mid Holocene South American summer. So let's look at this again. Here's the same example that I gave to you, okay, where we just had Delta 18O. And this question during low insulation, is this difference between the Lake Junin record, the shallow record represented by the red Delta 18O carbonate, is this difference due to a function of more evaporation? And can we test this with CAP 17O? So this was a case where we already were using multiple records to constrain the overall Delta 18O system. So this is interpreted as the intensification of the monsoon. But and it's thought that this separation in the early Holocene between Lake Junin and these other records because the system is more evaporated. But there was no way to actually test that hypothesis. And so enter 17O. And here's just some schematics from Sarah's paper. If you think that you just have moisture source processes and rainfall processes, this is 18O versus 17O, and then this is now flipped, just looking at CAP 17O. Anything with Rayleigh distillation or equilibrium processes should follow a horizontal line, versus if we have a evaporation, you would follow a line that sort of falls off of this CAP 17O slope. And this is Sarah just playing around with different temperature variations that could affect in terms of the process of mineralization of going from water to carbonate, which we haven't talked about in this talk, but there's stuff to explore there. Okay, so finally, so what do we see? This is the sort of the money plot, right? So this is what we've looked at before. This is the Delta 18O carbonate system record that we looked at earlier as well. What I just want to focus on is these squares are actually, these symbols are what we actually sampled. You can't sample things as high as resolution. The temperature record shows that there's really not much variation within this system. You can use these temperatures, certainly to the degree that we can actually detect it with our tool. But you can use these temperatures to feed them into reconstruct Delta 18O of formation water from this carbonate. And you can see these Junin values are high again. So they're higher they're higher, they're getting lower, but the magnitude of change is much smaller. And here we see that they're also lower in CAP 17.0. So this period where delta 18.0 values are high, where we think evaporation would be strongest, sure enough, we see that delta 18.0 values are lowest, so the deviation is lowest. And for comparison, this is the modern Lake Hunin system, and these are these modern Maicocha and Pumacocha systems as well. So these are quite low in CAP 17.0 values. So this is a quite evaporated system. So yes, we do think that this bigger difference is due to evaporation. And then these are these sort of conclusions again, and I'll just focus on that really being able to use this CAP 17.0 value to answer this question about this greater evaporation of evaporative flux. I'll mention too that this is, we actually ended up seeing, we did not expect to see variation in CAP 17.0 in these smaller lakes as we did in the green and blue. And this just means to say that there's more about the hydroclimate of these systems that we sort of need to understand better. So with that, I think I'm at the half-hour mark, and I'll just notice that there's so much to work on here, and my group has been tackling this in many different kinds of systems. This is a student who's working in the Cretaceous, so going to the Morrison Formation in the Western U.S. and looking at sort of Cretaceous hydroclimate. This is me. We're with a postdoc, Julia Kelson, looking at modern soil carbonates. This is a student working in Ethiopia on questions of human evolution change and using these systems to track evaporative fluxes. So the world's full of dark carbonates and even other minerals, apatites, and things to measure and to sort of use this to track many questions. And then there's a lot more to do to explore this 17.0 in modern systems. And I'll just end this. If anybody's going to AGU, here are some talks that are being presented this term, or this session on 17.0. So this is some of the places where our future work is going. So with that, I will sort of take questions. I know we don't have time for my other sort of topics here, but I'll end it here, and I'm happy to take questions from anybody and go into any detail that people have more questions about.
Naomi, thank you very much for the inspiring and very interesting talk. And thank you for the effort you made to join us today. And maybe there's some question? Yes?
Why do you think that Lake Hunin was more evaporative in relation to the other lakes that you measured?
Why is it more evaporated? Yeah, so we can look at, let's see, I think, if you only had the delta 18.0 values, you would say that it's higher in delta 18.0. And so that would be one sort of explanation. So you would say that the input water coming into all of the systems, if they're pretty close by, actually, so Pumacocha and Maicocha are quite close to Hunin, so you would think that the water coming into the systems is the same. So you would need to have some sort of way for the water in the lake to look different in Lake Hunin than the water in the lake from Maicocha. And so local hydrology and hydroclimate would be or local lake water balance would be a good way to actually do that. So evaporation drives oxygen isotopic composition of waters to be more positive. So this is why that's sort of was a common explanation to explain why it would be basically a lake hydrology question and a water balance question. And so Lake Hunin was considered to be at times a closed or a semi-closed, not fully closed, but a semi-closed lake basin. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Some more questions? Someone? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Naomi.
You're very welcome.
Keep on walking. It sounds really interesting. Full of work to do.
Yes, lots of work to do.
There is one question.
It might be apparent that I didn't follow the whole lecture, but what's the resolution that you can get to in terms of time?
In terms of time, any kind of resolution. So anything that you actually think that the original carbonate, the oxygen isotopic signature is recorded, is preserved, then you can use it. So as long as diagenesis hasn't wiped out your signal. So if you're using it, if you think that you're using it for the 18.0 to 16.0 ratio to get some sort of primary signal, then your 17.0 to 16.0 ratio should be good as well. So it's really limited to a diagenesis kinds of question. And so for example, so we're exploring these Cretaceous and actually Jurassic, so the Morrison Formation is Jurassic. And the first thing that we've sort of done is trying to understand is there been a diagenetic overprint? And in fact, actually, it's sort of because we also have this clumped isotopes, which tells us temperature, and then also multiple oxygen isotopes, it almost gives us more of a tool for even assessing diagenesis, right? So we have more of a fingerprint. So for example, if the clumped isotope temperatures are giving these like high burial temperatures, then we know that we're not getting depositional conditions preserved. So yeah. So it gives us, there's nothing like a magical solution to everything, but it just gives us a new window into systems. And the time limitation is really just going to be a matter of what other geological constraints and geochronological constraints you have.
Okay. Thank you.
And I'll just correct myself. I said that Lake Hunin was a sort of a semi-closed basin. It's actually sort of more of an open system, this is probably, you guys don't care, but this is being recorded. I figured I'd mention this, but it just means that you don't necessarily need a closed basin to have evaporative fluxes. You just basically need to sort of have a large output of the lake balance system to be driven by evaporation. But it doesn't necessarily need to be closed. But that's it.
Is Lake Hunin shallower than the other lakes that you measured?
So it's not necessarily, it might be slightly more shallow, but it's the geometry, it's proportionally very shallow. So it's this like more of this sort of pan. And it has all these sort of like flats around it. So it's much larger. So this is 20 kilometers and this is 0.4 kilometers. So these other lakes are these like small sort of glacially carved out lakes. And the hydrology is actually just different. So you can actually have a very big system, but if a lot of the outs, a large proportion of the sort of the mass hydrologic balance of you're losing a lot of water to evaporation, then you're going to get that kinetic evaporation effect that's going to affect your sort of reservoir. Whereas these smaller lake systems, there's water sort of just flushing right through them. So you've got the input waters from the rivers coming in and you've got rivers coming out, and not a large portion of the water is being lost via evaporation. However, we learned something that we didn't actually expect, is that there's more variation in CAP 17O in these smaller lake systems going back in the past. So their hydrology actually might be more complicated than we actually thought it was. So it's not necessarily small, but it's about just sort of balancing the ins and outs. And if all of your ins and outs just have that equilibrium fractionation, then you're not going to see much isotopic variation. But if you have a big component of your outs that are evaporation, then that's going to kick you off the 17O sort of flat line. Yeah.
Okay, then. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you. Take care. Have a good day, guys.
Good day too.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.